Well, hello everybody. I am Lauren Lawson, and this is my guide to sourdough bread. So this is probably attempt number 5 or so to get this recorded correctly. So hopefully this will transfer over to everybody. All right. So I have adapted this sourdough bread recipe and methods from a couple different recipes and books that I have found. But so far, so good. I've been baking for just about 4 years now. I did start right before COVID and made my own starter. So, of course, when everybody was like, oh, you're making sourdough bread because of COVID. Nope, I started beforehand, but just a few months. All right, so what you're going to need, you are going to need a starter. So that is basically the yeast buildup. People will either make these themselves, or the most common is to get one from a friend or neighbor. A friend of mine just got a 100-year-old starter, which is pretty awesome. Mine is only 4 years old, but they're all going to have different flavor profiles and react different to different ways of doing things. So it's a live entity. It's pretty cool. You're going to need a digital kitchen scale. Those are pretty cheap on Amazon. Dutch oven. I like my big Lodge cast iron one, but whatever works for you. A large bowl with a lid preferably, but it doesn't have to have one. Medium bowl, dough scraper, bread lame, which is the sharp knife you're going to cut your bread with. Banneton baskets, parchment paper. I like using King Arthur all-purpose flour and then King Arthur brand bread flour. We're going to use both of those because the bread flour is going to give it more of a bready texture versus the all-purpose flour is going to make it a little bit stiffer. Rye flour, this is optional. However, I have had much better success using a little bit of rye flour. When I ran out of it, my starter was not as happy. Rice flour, you're going to line the Banneton baskets with that just to keep your dough from sticking. Salt and water. All right, so step 1. So this is going to take you over a 2-day span. So when I get up in the morning to get ready for work, this is step 1. So this is in the morning, but you can do this at night and just swap the times for everything. But these are all the supplies you'll need. So you'll need a little plastic container. You'll need some water, a spatula, a fork, your scale, your starter, the all-purpose flour, and the rye flour. So you're going to, in a medium bowl with a lid, you're going to use about 120 grams of starter and equal parts water and all-purpose flour. This is where you can also add in a little bit of that rye flour too. I just substitute some of the rye flour for the regular all-purpose flour, and it just gives it a little bit more oomph when it's rising, and it also helps with the flavor profile. So you're gonna do equal parts. So if you are just making this recipe, I forgot to mention, is for 2 loaves, but if you want to make just one, you can cut everything in half. So you're going to mix this well, cover, and allow to sit in a warm area for about 10 to 12 hours. So again, this is first thing in the morning. So you go to work, and then when you come home is when you go to step 2. So this is in the afternoon. As you can see in the photo here, the starter has doubled in size. He has risen. And so now we're going to get all of our stuff out. So the picture on the right-hand side is the top of the starter. You can see some bubbles in there. On the inside, it's a lot more bubbly. So in our large mixing bowl, we're going to mix together the roughly 300 grams of starter, and then 680 grams of room temperature water. So I like to use the water first, or measure the water first, then reset my scale, and then I'll put in about 300 grams of starter. You want to make sure that your starter is floating. If it's not floating, it's not ready. So then you have to kind of start again because it's not ready to make bread for you. So once you have your starter in your 680 grams of water, you're going to swish it around a little bit. You can use a fork, you can use your fingers, just to kind of integrate that water and that starter together. All right, and then so in another bowl, in my little metal bowl here, we are going to measure about 400 grams of all-purpose flour and about 600 grams of bread flour for a total of 100 grams. So I don't do this exactly. So sometimes it may be a little bit more or less of each of those, but just as long as you have about that ratio, and again, you can experiment whatever works for you. Once you measure out that 1,000 grams of flour, you're going to dump it into your large bowl of the starter and water mixture. Then you're going to measure about 20 grams of salt, and you're going to set that aside. Using a fork or spoon, you're going to start mixing your flour, water, and starter. Once it's kind of clumpy, then you can dump the salt on top. The reason you want to wait with the salt is because it could inhibit the starter a little bit, like it's a, shock to the system. And then so you're going to use the dough scraper and your hands to incorporate everything together until everything is wet. So we're not kneading it here, we're just mixing it. So as long as you've got some kind of a chunky dough thing going on, you're fine. So you're going to cover this and you're going to set it aside for 30 minutes. That's just going to allow everything to get moist. And then from there, while your dough is setting aside getting moist, our fun word there, you're going to use the remainder of the starter and add equal parts of water and flour to feed it. So this is your dough scraping, or sorry, your starter scraping from your starter bowl. I like to do about 30 to 50 grams of the starter just to make sure I have enough. And then you're going to do that same amount of water and that same amount of flour. And again, here I use a little bit of rye flour to feed mine a little extra. So you want at least 110 grams so that you have that to get your next thing going. You're going to set that aside for 30 minutes and then put it in the refrigerator until your next use. Side note on the starter, if you are not using that on a regular basis, you will want to feed that about once a week, maybe 2 weeks, but you don't want to push it too far. Otherwise, you'll start making alcohol. All right, so after those 30 minutes have passed, now you are going to leave the dough in the bowl, but you're going to use a dough scraper and your hands to pull and stretch the dough for about 5 to 7 minutes. You'll feel the dough kind of change texture and elasticity as you go. And once the gluten has developed, you're going to loosely cover the dough and allow it to sit for 1 hour. So I believe I have a video here. We're going to play this. So this is how you pull and stretch your dough. So we're just pulling from the sides, going around and round. I say, stretch the gluten or gluten develop, like I know what I'm talking about, but I don't know the science behind this. I just like bread. So once we do that, we are going to loosely cover that. I just set the lid on top. And then if you don't have a lid, you can use a damp kitchen towel. Just make sure it's covered so that it doesn't dry out. And then once we sit for about 1 hour and 30 minutes, you're going to pull and stretch the dough for about 1 minute, knocking out most of the air. And then you're going to cover it and allow it to sit for another 1 hour and 30 minutes. So back up here, we have our initial 30-minute rest while everything gets moist. Then we do the 5 to 7 minutes of pull and stretch. Let it sit for 1.5 hours. Pull and stretch it for about 1 minute. Then you're going to let it sit for another 1.5 hours. So this is an all afternoon event. Oops, we're playing that video again. All right, so after your second proof, you are going to wipe down your countertop with a wet paper towel. You're going to sprinkle some flour and kind of spread it out. Make sure you have a good layer of flour because you don't want your dough sticking to your countertop. Using the dough scraper, you're basically going to scrape out your dough and dump it on the countertop. And then with your dough scraper, you're going to divide the dough into 2 equal pieces. It doesn't have to be exact. I don't measure this out. One time the dough may be bigger. One time it's smaller. No one really cares. It's delicious bread. All right. So 1 piece at a time, you're going to book fold the dough onto itself. So pick a corner of your round dough and you're going to pull it to the center of the dough ball. Pick up the opposite corner and repeat. The goal here is to make a really tight ball as you pull and stretch the dough into itself. So once you feel it is a good dough ball, and this is just up to your preference, you're going to turn it over seam side down gently with your hands, and you're going to tuck it under itself. You're going to repeat all of that with the second dough ball. And then you're going to cover both dough balls with a kitchen towel for about 30 minutes. And please pardon the boomer filming here. This is my mother volunteering to film me making dough balls. So here we are scraping out the dough. Me working quickly. Cut it into 2 pieces, roughly half. The dough is very sticky, so just make sure you have plenty of flour. All right, so we're gonna book fold it onto itself. So just any loose pieces or any corners pulling it in. You can see how it's kind of tightening up on itself. We're gonna flip it over and then see how we're tucking it under. Almost like we're tucking somebody into bed, but we're just tucking all of that dough under. It's gonna help us get that beautiful tight ball, which is what we want. All right, so after you let those 2 dough balls rest for 30 minutes, you are going to have your Banneton baskets. I like to use rice flour in my Banneton basket because it's not going to stick to the Banneton basket. If you just put your dough in there plain, it will stick to the Banneton basket, and that's very sad. So you're gonna gently pick up your dough ball and put it seam side up. So you can see in the picture in the middle here, we have our seam side up, meaning like where we've tucked it in. You're gonna put that in there and you're gonna cover it. So you can either have the little linen cover that it comes with or just put a cloth over it. But you're gonna let that sit overnight. Because remember, we started the starter in the morning. This is it in the evening now when we've made our dough balls. And then you're gonna let it sit overnight. So the next day, I recommend that you're gonna leave those Banneton baskets with your dough up until about lunchtime. And then after lunchtime, you're gonna put those in the refrigerator. If you don't have a way, like if you have to go to work, put them in the refrigerator in the morning. They're gonna be fine. You may not have as much flavor profile, but as long as you put them in the fridge. So at some point you need to put them in the fridge, whether it's at night or in the morning. But when you are ready to bake, you are going to preheat your oven and your Dutch oven to 475. So what I would recommend is you're going to experiment with this. It's going to take you a few times to, figure out what works and what doesn't. The recipe calls for 475. The oven that I have at home, I do at 470, just because 475 is a little bit too high. You're going to allow it to preheat for about 15 minutes after the beep. So after your oven reaches full temperature, you're still going to leave that Dutch oven in there for about 15 more minutes so that it can preheat fully. All right, so now you're going to cut 2 pieces of parchment paper and about 14 by 14. And you're going to take your first basket from the fridge very carefully after you take the lid off. You're going to overturn it onto your piece of parchment paper. And then once it's out of the basket, you're going to use your bread lame to score the top of it. For your first few, I'd recommend just doing a crisscross like this, but you can get fancier with the more experience. I just did like wheat sheafs on mine. It was pretty cool, but this works just as well. All right, so you're immediately going to take out your very hot Dutch oven, take the lid off, and carefully lower your dough ball into there. You're going to cover it, and you're going to place it back into the oven, excuse me, for about 23 minutes. So again, experimentation. The recipe that I used initially called for 25 minutes. 23 I found was a sweet spot for this. After those 23 to 25 minutes, you're going to take off the lid. So open up your actual oven, take off the lid of the Dutch oven. I like to turn it a little bit too, so you get an even bake. And then you're going to cook it for about another 18 minutes. So 18 to 20 minutes. If you have a larger loaf, a minute or 2 longer. If you have a smaller loaf, a minute or 2 less. What? All right, so after your final alarm goes off, you are going to remove your Dutch oven and you're going to pull the bread out by the parchment paper. Place it on a wire rack to cool for at least 40 minutes. I know you want to eat it now, but you need that inside to solidify up. If you want to make sure it's baked fully, you're going to knock on the bottom. It sounds hollow. You're good to go. It becomes habit. You're going to repeat the same steps with your second bowl of or loaf of bread, and then you have 2 loaves of bread. And now you can eat them. So I hope that this was helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments, just pop them down in the comment section, and hopefully you liked this video. Have a wonderful day.